Welcome. Good morning or good afternoon, depending upon where you're zooming in from, but a very warm welcome from the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph. The Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph is a consortium of 9 member organization colleges and universities founded by the Sisters of St. Joseph. I'm Martha Malinsky and the executive director for the association. I'm so pleased that you're able to join us today for our Quality of Learning workshop. This is the third in a series of 4 faculty development workshops that we've offered this spring. Just a few reminders, this and all workshops in this series are being recorded and will be available on the association's website at www.acssj.org. The workshop is being offered in a meeting format to allow interaction among colleagues. So please be sure to mute your microphone. Since the start of the COVID-19 pandemic, the chief academic officers at the 9 ACSSJ institutions sought to identify a speaker or a series of speakers who would address what we have learned with regard to the dynamics of the pandemic and how they're impacting our teaching and learning across our institutions. In seeking this expertise, we noted a need for more evidence-based work that informed our institutions about faculty experiences and the strategies they could use or were using in adapting their work to the changing needs of learners post-pandemic. Today's event represents our interest in lifting up the voices and expertise of our faculty and staff at each of our ACSSJ institutions and to develop an evidence base to support our work. Our moderator and panelists will share their perspectives today regarding the initial analysis of the survey of ACSSJ faculty that yielded 292 responses and focused on faculty perceptions of students' experiences and needs and changes in or enhancements in their approaches to teaching. Thank you to Chris Doherty from Chestnut Hill College and to the chief academic officers who continue to make contributions to this work. We are so glad that you are here today to engage in a conversation of quality of learning. And with that, I'm going to turn it over and introduce our moderator for today's panel, Dr. Margaret McLane, Provost and Vice President for Academic Affairs at the College of St. Rose.
Thank you, Martha, and I welcome you all as well to this panel discussion, and am very pleased that we have 3 terrific faculty presenters with us today, Dr. Peter DePergola, Dr. Lisa Oliverio, and Dr. Jen Marlow. And I'll share a little bit more about them as I introduce each of them and they share their perspectives. As Martha indicated, this series grew out of a survey that was conducted at our institutions when we asked faculty to reflect on their experiences during COVID and in the immediate aftermath of COVID. We all know that, 3 years ago, our campuses, probably within 2 weeks of this date, changed drastically. And, I have to say for us, we thought it might be 2 weeks. We didn't realize that 3 years later, we'd still be figuring things out. But it has helped us, I think, look at our teaching and learning in different ways and to expand the conversation about quality of learning. One of the quotes from the survey that really resonated with me was, a respondent who was concerned about backlash from faculty about online learning being inferior, and that we should reduce it and never think about it going forward, that post-pandemic, we shouldn't be applying lessons that we learned during the pandemic. And I think that is unfair. and not realistic. We're not the same world that we were 3 years ago, even though we share many concerns, and we still have the same desire to provide exceptional learning experiences for our students. Today and in the future, we may need to look at that differently. So at this point, I'm going to turn things over to our first speaker, and that is Dr. Peter DePergola. Dr. DePergola is the Shaughness Family Chair for the Study of Humanities at ELMS College, where he is also Assistant Professor of Bioethics and Medical Humanities, and the Executive Director of the St. Augustine Center for Ethics, Religion, and Culture. Peter?
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for that introduction, and let me first begin by expressing my profound gratitude to ACSSJ for hosting this event, to Martha Malinsky for her leadership in organizing it, and to you, Dr. McLane, for facilitating this panel. I would also like to thank my fellow panelists, from whom I've learned an incredible amount while preparing for this event. I owe each of you a debt of gratitude and am honored to serve on this panel alongside you. At the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, I was disproportionately bogged down by my clinical work, adjacent to my academic work as Chief Ethics Officer at Bay State Health in Springfield, Massachusetts. That same clinical work, which culminated with being appointed by Governor Charlie Baker to serve on the Massachusetts Department of Public Health Crisis Standards of Care Advisory Committee, a small group of experts tasked with creating an ethical algorithm for distributing scarce critical care resources such as ventilators, ECMO machines, and other life-sustaining interventions, radically shaped the way I approached and continue to approach students in my classroom. The uncertainty of the pandemic confronted each person, young and old, with personal questions about meaning, purpose, identity, and value. In short, it required us to assess the quality or lack thereof in our lives. What this productively discomforting experience demonstrated to me, especially in the classroom, is that the quality of my students' learning was largely, if not entirely, dependent on their quality of life. My students were understandably nervous, afraid, grieving, and distracted. What I needed to do, something I realized at the bedside before I recognized it in the classroom, was to first address my students' quality of life before I could reasonably ask them to produce, let alone subjectively assess, the quality of their learning. It seemed to me axiomatic that quality of life was, and is, a necessary precondition for quality of learning. My goal was to create a classroom environment in which I was able to gauge students' quality of life and thereby provide them a forum in which they could identify items both to celebrate on the one hand and from which to heal on the other. So I did what I usually do when trying to assess and then solve a problem: create a tool by which I could weigh and balance what I wanted to assess. Because quality is a somewhat nebulous concept, I tried to adapt a definition of quality that is regularly used in healthcare, namely providing the right care at the right time, for the right patient, in the right way, and for the right reason. To maintain the analogy, if we imagine that professors are the providers and students are the patients, then high-quality professors, like high-quality providers, make sure students receive the right information at the right time, in the right way, and for the right reason. As a true son of the humanities, I define quality of learning for students as a prolonged and active engagement with course material in a way so as to create the possibility of deriving personal meaning, purpose, identity, and value therefrom, both as it pertains to current and future quality of life. Based on more than a decade of teaching experience, the best indicator to date of student engagement and student success vis-a-vis quality of learning in my classroom has been positively correlated to instances whereby students reach out to me, typically via email, to express interest in the subject matter and to ask questions that further the conversation outside of the in-person and virtual classroom interactions, and second, outside of the interactions directly related to the submission of required coursework. Given this fact, I went back 3 years to determine first the number of students taught and second, the number of student interactions that were positively correlated to student success, outcomes, and learning quality. Taking a baseline of 1,027 students over 3 years from 2017 to 2020, I identified 737 students, approximately 72%, who engaged in this positively correlated way. With a 10% goal of increasing engagement by directly addressing quality of life concerns related to the course with students, I implemented a protocol by which I would reach out to students individually at multiple points in the semester and ask them 3 fundamental questions related to general and course-related quality of life. First, what are you looking forward to? Second, what are you most concerned about? 3, how can I support you? Since 2021, I've reached out to an additional 803 students over 2 years by asking all 3 questions during week 1, following up on concerns and offering support by week 3, following up on what they are looking forward to by week 5, following up on concerns and offering support during week 7, following up and offering support during week 9, following up about concerns again at week 11, and again following up on what they're looking forward to in week 13, following up on concerns and offering support during week 14, and then finally during week 15, following up on what they're looking forward to, their concerns and how I might continue to help them feel supported far beyond the course during week 15. So of the 803 students, I identified 763, some 95%, who engaged in a positively correlated way. The results yielded an increase in engagement and quality of learning by an astounding 23%. What matters most, it turns out, is precisely what we have always believed. Our students will never care how much we know until they know how much we care. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. And now we will turn to Dr. Lisa Oliverio. Lisa is Associate Professor of English at FONTBONNE University and also the co-director of the Center for Teaching and Learning. Lisa?
Hello. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about this important issue with so many wonderful colleagues. About my own experience, really post-pandemic, after taking about a year teaching asynchronously and then returning to face-to-face classes with an expectation that things would look like they did before. And as I think many of us know, they simply did not. Particularly what I noticed is that students, even when they often seemed engaged, were submitting assignments at both formative and summative at lower rates in that return to face-to-face learning. Others who seemed to be demonstrating learning within the classroom were not demonstrating that same learning in the assessment. So in other words, it seemed to me that students were either not learning the course material or objectives in the way that they had before, or they were not demonstrating that learning via the assessments, which were assessments that I had been using for years. So today I want to talk about one change that I have made this year in response to that experience that I had last academic year. And really what I did was expand a type of experimentation that I had started before the pandemic that has had an impact on both the rate of completion of work which in my field actually has a tie, I think, to that quality of learning, and also the quality of work. So I'm going to talk a bit about what Bonnie Stachowiak has coined choose your own adventure assessment. While I'm talking about one method here, I'm really thinking about flexible assessment, which can be broken down and done in a number of smaller and more manageable ways. So Pretorius, Van Morik, and Barat define flexible assessment very broadly as, quote, giving students control over assessment weighting, type or format, timing, criteria, or overall assessment results. In other words, it's giving students autonomy over how they demonstrate their learning. While our learning objectives can sometimes limit student choice in what they learn and when they learn it, we can provide some options in how students grapple with course material and demonstrate mastery of content knowledge and procedural knowledge. So the basic way that it works and the way that Bonnie Stachowiak introduced this in the Teaching in Higher Ed podcast was sort of shaped around her business ethics course, where she created a menu of assessment choices. At the start of each semester, students would be able to choose an assessment option for each of the learning objectives. In order to maintain some consistency in assessment, students would have to take 3 exams, including a cumulative final exam. So that menu of choices is what was always kind of in the back of my head. Within that menu, students are able to choose the format or type. In all of my classes, I have started to implement this, which means that students, maybe when the goal is not to learn academic writing, might instead build a website, engage in service learning, create Instagram posts or TikTok accounts, and other methods of engaging that material. And then lastly, there is also options in weighting assessment, which means that students can have a voice in how much each assessment is within the overall course grade. So I am not terribly adventurous in my grading, and I like to do things, or in my courses, and I like to try one small thing out at a time. So I essentially boiled that menu of options down to 2 different grading schemas that has variations in both assessment format and assessment weighting. So this year, in all of my general education literature courses, all students work on a few major projects, and I have increased the number of options with formats for those students, but all students complete those. After that, they have a choice in how they demonstrate their learning. So students can choose to take a midterm and final, or in some courses, a series of 3 tests that assess content knowledge and close reading skills, or they can choose a weekly writing activity where they write on each of our readings and write a paper that involves synthesizing information at the end of the course, along with 3 low point value quizzes. So in my courses, what I have seen is that increasing student choice has led to a significant increase in the number of students who actually complete all of the work within the course, particularly major assignments. Particularly this semester, I have seen a return to pre-pandemic rates of submission. Students regularly report that they feel a greater commitment to the work because they chose it. And I think that the reason for this has to do with how student autonomy and assessment aligns with the science of teaching and learning. It allows students to center their strengths in particular. And what we know about that strength-based model is that allowing students to choose their strengths can increase performance, effort, and willingness to engage in tasks. It also gives us the option to create some more authentic learning experiences for students, especially a different generation of students who understand themselves often as content creators. Thank you.
Thank you, Lisa, for sharing your work and the current results with us. And now we'll hear from Dr. Jennifer Marlow. Jen is the professor of English here at the College of St. Rose. She is also the coordinator of first-year writing and has served as the Standish Endowed Chair for her department. Jen?
Great, thank you. Hi, everybody. Thanks to Margaret for inviting me to speak here today, and to Martha for running this series, which has been wonderful so far. I've gotten to go to the other sessions as well. And Lisa and Peter, those were both so helpful, and I'm already thinking a lot about things that I can do with what you both talked about. So to preface what I just stuck also in the chat is a little kind of cheat sheet that I created for my, for what I'm talking about today, in case people want to see more of it in print and have access to what I'm talking about. So just to preface what I'm talking about today, which is going to be using best by dates and on-grading to increase quality of student learning, I just want to mention 2 Inside Higher Ed opinion pieces that were published just this past January. Some of you may have seen them or read about them. They generated some online conversation in Twitter. So one was by Louise Haas, who wrote about bringing back the F grade as a foundation of student success. And he was arguing in favor of using the F grade to basically motivate students to pay attention and do their work. And he was speaking out against practices like on-grading and no penalties for excessive absences and things like that as wrong-headed and misguided attempts at achieving student success. And then that was the first piece. And then Benjamin Rifkin replied with his own opinion piece about let's not bring back the F grade, arguing instead that we assign authentic tasks that reflect the kind of work we want students to do after they graduate and are out of school. And so I just point to these to kind of frame out the ongoing debate about the relationship between grades and student learning. And that, I mean, this has been going on for years, and that this kind of range of arguments still is very vigorously debated. So I'm suggesting, like I said, a combination of using best by dates and on-grading or upgrading, as a couple of my students keep referring to it as a means of increasing the quality of student learning, if not the actual quality of their work. And I'm influenced by Alfie Cohn's thinking on this subject, where his work indicates that grades actually reduce the quality of student learning. And I will also say that my version of on-grading, which I'll describe, which I just began for the first time this semester, is not nearly radical enough for what Cohn would want from on-grading, which is really a dismantling of grades in higher ed in general. And in fact, there was just an NPR piece out the other day about how a number of colleges are moving to that model. So mine is a kind of, well, you'll see. It's not what he's advocating for sure. So on-grading is defined in many different ways. I'm using Jesse Stammel's definition, which he describes it as raising an eyebrow at grades as a systemic practice distinct from simply not grading. The word is a present participle, an ongoing process, not a static set of practices. And so my own system of on-grading involves assigning numbers. These are not points, or these will never be turned into percentages. They're simply numbers that kind of represent how much quality, how much a student has pushed themselves on their assignments. So it's a 0 through 2 scale on assignments and a 0 to 3 scale for class participation. These numbers are then looked at in terms of, do you have a higher number of 2s and 3s, or a higher number of 0s and 1s. And in the end, students will, well, actually at 2 points in the semester, students will grade themselves, both at midterm and at the end of the semester. and they have to provide supporting evidence of their work, particularly stressing what they've learned in the course, as well as providing the numerical data, these numbers that are assigned to their assignments and participation to illustrate their choice of grade. So at midterm, they compose a 2 to 3 page written assessment document, and the final grade will be similar, but will be comprised of also a work portfolio and a presentation. So switching over to best by dates, as the name indicates, are due dates that don't expire on the date and time that assignments are due. Like on grading, and I should mention that this was a pandemic pedagogy that I've held on to. So I started these during the pandemic, like as soon as we pivoted, and I've kept them. So from my syllabus, I describe them as, for the most part, due dates in this class are best by dates. That is, they are dates that I suggest you complete your work by in order to stay on top of what we are learning in class and to get the most out of the scaffolding built into the class that is designed to help you succeed at your larger assignments. This means that with a few exceptions, you can submit work late without any penalty. And then I give them the exceptions to those: daily takeaways, peer review, and conference drafts. I describe them to my students like the date, stamped on a milk carton. Ideally, you should drink the milk by the date marked on the carton, but if you drink it past midnight or the next day, nothing terrible is going to happen in terms of the quality of the milk, or nor to your health. And then obviously, the longer you wait to drink that milk, the more diminished the quality becomes, and you also are putting your health at risk. Because I haven't been utilizing the on-grading system for a long period of time. I don't have the kind of data and feedback that Peter has on his work, but I do have some student comments from their midterm assessments, and I'll read just one of them, and I will end there. So one student writes, "The ungrading system feels incredibly nice to work with. In combination with the best by dates, these systems actually make the work for the class feel engaging, because I know that there's this forgiving, or perhaps non-punitive is a better descriptor, system in place. I've had to rush assignments in other classes just to get them done, but that hasn't been an issue in this class. I truly feel as though I've been able to produce some high quality work as a result. I wish more professors would adopt this way of running things." Thank you.
So thank you, Jen. And we'd like to open this up to conversation, questions. You can use the chat. You can raise your hand. Rebecca, it looks like you're clapping. And I agree. Nice job, presenters. Thoughts, comments? So we do have one comment from Valerie in the chat, who indicates that she's worked with choice menus before. And in her experience, students really love it, but they aren't used to it, so they need a lot of scaffolding. I'm wondering if any of our panelists or anyone in the group would like to talk about that idea of scaffolding and helping students get to that point. Valerie, you want to say something?
An online asynchronous course, which is going to be way different from if you're offering this in a face-to-face version, right? So I have a lot of challenge around, just getting students to read things, and watch little videos and whatnot. So for me, after trying this a couple of times and meeting students halfway through and finding out that they had no idea that it was an option, even though it was presented in the very first week, I learned I need a quiz, right? I need to put a little quiz in the first week to see, do you understand how you're being graded in this class? Because it was basically like half the points were up to them, half the points were up to me, right? And so I gave them a little menu And there were different activities that they could do that were worth different amounts of points. And they basically got to decide how they wanted to engage in the course. So I put in like a little no stakes quiz, really just like, you have to do this first week. Do you understand what's happening? And then would check in with the people that like clearly, didn't watch the little videos or read the information about it, to give them some more. I found that that was still not necessarily enough. Like I had one thing that was that they could, rather than do a traditional discussion forum, create a meme based on the week's topic. And this is a technology and ethics course. And nobody was taking me up on it. And I'm like, well, this is such a fun little activity. Why is nobody doing this, right? And so one discussion forum, rather than posting a traditional response of like a paragraph, 2 paragraphs, they all needed to create a meme based on that week's topic. I gave them some resources for how to do that for people who maybe hadn't done it before. Then suddenly I start seeing more of those pop up in future forums. They're like, I get to do this. There's points for doing this more creative thing. And so there was like a continual process. Like I learned over the course of doing this, like maybe 4 or 5 different semesters. Like each time I'm like, oh, okay, I need to put in this quiz. Oh, okay, I need to put in this scaffolding. Oh, okay, I need to rejigger percentages of like how many points I'm allowing for them versus what I'm doing. And then the last thing I put in there is that you are absolutely going to have students who are not comfortable with this. They just want you to tell them, what do I need to do? And so it's super important to just have the default method, for me in an asynchronous course, you can be like, once to the forum, twice to your peers, etc. That sort of thing, like just put in the formula for them. The last piece of thing that I will say to folks is that grades can get kind of tricky. So if you end up doing something like I did, where it basically is like over the course of the semester, half of their grade is activities that they're doing, it can look an awful lot to them like they're failing because it's for the entire semester, right? And so there might be different ways that you want to break it down rather than for the entire semester, week by week, or to do an awful lot of reassuring that you're not failing the course. It's just because we're early on in this. You're going to get more points as you go along. But yeah, that's my very long, building context, and hopefully somebody can take something from that if they're wanting to use this method in the future.
Thank you, Valerie. So we do have a question for Peter. Peter, can you talk about how you are measuring the increase in quality of learning, and talk about what these many check-ins look like?
Sure, absolutely. I'd be happy to. So to the first question, how am I measuring the engagement? That would be based on sort of the original plan, which was to see how many students would, it's sort of a student proactive engagement. So a student reaching out to me, not in the context of the classroom and not in the context of submitting an assignment. It wouldn't be, I'm submitting this paper for evaluation. Hey, I really like the readings for this week. It had to be outside of those engagements and not after class. Hey, I really like what's going on. It had to be completely external and sort of originate with the student themselves in an extracurricular context. For the second part of the question, what do those many check-ins look like? It regularly looks like me reaching out in an email, just as I expect them to reach out to me during the measurement to say, sort of how are things going? I know at the beginning of the course you were really excited about X. How is the course bringing you closer to what you were looking forward to? Also, I know you were concerned at the beginning of the course about being able to keep up with the reading. How's that been so far? And then finally, what do you need? What can I do to be most helpful? And it could be an exchange where the student would say, would I be able to focus a little bit more heavily on this text rather than this text for the research paper? And that would be perfectly acceptable if that would still stay in line with the content of the course. So it's those sort of touch points, following up on our last conversation, just generally asking how they're doing, how the semester is going, how their family is doing, how they're doing. So it's informal in nature, but structured according to what I'm asking.
Can I just follow up really quick? Those questions are, I thought for a minute those questions were specifically aimed at the course, and then at the end you kind of shifted to the family. So I'm wondering if you
They're not necessarily directly related to the course. So you know, the questions are, again, sort of, what are you looking forward to? What are you most concerned about? And what do you, how can I support you? And so that can be absolutely course related, but they're open-ended. They don't need to answer a question to me about their family. They can, to say, actually, the course is going well, but things are really difficult, or I need an extension. My mom is sick. So I would include those interactions as broadly including, it could be exclusive to the course or inclusive of other quality of life assessments or comments.
Thank you, Peter and Rebecca. Peter, I actually have a bit of probably a somewhat mundane question, but this outreach is via email.
Yes.
And, you know, sometimes, I know we struggle with getting students to engage in email. But it sounds like you haven't run into that issue, or is it a concern as you're reaching out to students?
No, you know, it has not been much of an issue for me. I found students to be very sort of responsive in email. You know, I say this sort of tongue in cheek. We all work at Catholic colleges. There's a little bit of that guilt where maybe they were raised in families where, listen, if somebody reaches out, you have to be polite and reach back. So that's certainly been my experience.
Thank you. Jen Lobsher, you have a question?
Oh, I just wanted to point out a couple of things. I think that Peter's strategy could be really well adapted to a weekly check-in with students. I think that was one of the things that in the course that I was teaching, I think that was one of the things the students appreciate. Very similar questions, and it was a fully asynchronous course. So in every module or every week, there was a form that they would fill out, and some did and some didn't. And I think it's a great way to create the community and to have instructor presence in a course.
Thank you. You have other questions or comments? Sister Sean?
I'm wondering, for the people who use the choice menu, what kind of strategies do you use to say this TikTok video is equal to this, post on a chat or whatever? How do you equate across the variety of opportunities that students have to demonstrate their learning?
Speak to how I do it. So it would obviously depend on the learning objective. In some cases, in a composition course where what we're really talking about are discourse communities, they are both using the same content, but perhaps having to present it to a particular group like incoming college students. And therefore, they're almost demonstrating more awareness of some of the concepts by using a TikTok rather than writing a 5-page paper. But in my literature courses, I actually ask students to, if they do a more creative option, I ask them to write an explanatory paper that still has that close reading and analysis of the original text. So for instance, they may take a short story and revise the genre into a poem to demonstrate understanding of how genres function. And then I'm going to ask them to write a 3 or 4 page paper that explains how they're reading the original text, what choices they made and why they made it. So they're still doing that similar analytical work, but they're just almost starting from a different point than the students who choose to write a traditional analysis.
Thank you, Lisa. Jen, did you have anything you wanted to add?
I just actually, I don't want to take away though, if somebody else wants to speak to the menu of choices. I just wanted to go back to the scaffolding. You know, it was the same kind of comment, but I think with all of these approaches, you know, the choose your own adventure, or the choice menus, and certainly like the ungrading and the best by dates, and even Peter's kind of reaching out to students, right? These are all things that students are not accustomed to. And so obviously, like the student comments that I included were the positive, you know, were the positive feedback that I've received. But that's not to say I have plenty of students who get really freaked out by doing things differently as well. Like I mean, that's the whole thing about ungrading, right? That they've been trained in this system of education to, like, you know, answer to grades. That's their primary concern. And so I think for a lot of these, it's so important to have these conversations with students, you know, just making your pedagogy transparent. Here's why I'm doing this, you know, like Peter's doing frequent check-ins. I mean, I meet with students, I conference with them and talk about, you know, how is the system working for you? And kind of talking through how it works and why it's important, and the philosophy undergirding it, so that they really understand where these systems are coming from.
Thanks, Jen. Lauren, you have your hands up?
I did, and I'm glad that Jen brought that up, because one of the things that we run into that I'm interested in terms of how what we're discussing would meet this is this, for particularly for the scholarship students. I mean, they're so grade centered, and you know, so I had two questions. I mean, how do you dislodge that? Because it's, for some of them, that's all they know. And they really are incapable to, because they feel like they answer to someone else. And so that becomes a really big element in their academic life, that actually without those, without grades, if you were going to flirt with ungrading, would actually cause them more stress than having to get a good grade. And so we're kind of creating an environment where these students can't succeed because they're just so uncomfortable in that environment. But the second question that I had, and forgive my ignorance on this, but how are you finding the time to grade a variety of exercises, or to track who's doing what exercise? Or if a student says, I'm going to do the TikTok, but then changes their mind and does another, I mean, I can barely keep track of the days I have a scheduled exam, let alone who's handing in what at what time. So I'm curious as to how you're managing all of those elements, because that seems overwhelming, just hearing about it. And I couldn't even imagine implementing it.
So I think I do a modified version of this. As I said in the comments, I'm not actually quite brave enough to give my students a whole menu of assignments and say, pick some at the start of the semester. So instead, what I generally do is I say, here are two grading schemas, and they're both on the syllabus, and they have a different breakdown of grades. I have them now complete a survey on the LMS at the start of the semester. They can change up until the first quiz, and that's it. After that, they are locked in. And the real trick for me at this point is actually making sure that when I assign an assignment or a quiz or an exam on the LMS, that I only assign it to the students in that group. I have to set a little reminder to myself when I have that ready, because it doesn't go to everybody, and that's how they know. And then with those format options, those still are all submitted as project one, right? So project one is just one assignment. you can pick whatever you like. You don't have to be locked into that at the outset of the semester. Those are just kind of all laid out and they all get submitted into the same place. So I'm not really having to keep track of that any more than I would have if it was just one choice and they had to submit it in the same spot.
And I can speak a little bit also to the first part of the question about the students for whom ungrading is deeply uncomfortable. And again, I have students for whom that is the case. So, I mean, one is what I already talked about, right? Meeting with students, talking with them. I mean, and again, I haven't broken from grading in the radical way that many folks are advocating for when they talk about ungrading. So I just, I submitted their midterm grades via Navigate and gave them plentiful feedback. And so, giving them a lot of feedback and really letting them know where they are at in a more traditional way along the way. I also do that through the way that I handle. So for example, with assignments on the 0 to 2 scale, a 1 is what I call a revise and resubmit, right? So, I'm handling it in a way that's like very academic, right? Like this is what happens if you're publishing in the world of academia. And even if you're not going into academia, you're going into jobs that, undoubtedly you're going to produce work and they're going to come back to you and say, can you do this better? Can you do it differently? Here's what this needs to look like. And so I'm trying to do it in that kind of very real world way of like, okay, you have a 1, it's a revise and resubmit. Here's a bunch of feedback that I want you to take into consideration and think about, having the opportunity to reshape your work. So I think, it's intended to be there as a kind of safety net and a kind of, release from the pressure cooker of grades. And I just try to keep reiterating that for and to the students for whom that kind of freaks them out.
Thank you both for that clarity.
Is there anybody else who would like to share or comment?
Unmute. I'm
Margaret?
Barbara from Chestnut Hill. This is mostly for Jen, I think, but it could be either of you. Do you have, for instance, in a writing program, maybe 4 or 5 people experimenting with the same thing so that students hear from other students who are going through this, they have a similar procedure? Does that make sense?
So I think that's for you, Lisa.
Oh, I see. I took that as an ungrading question.
Might be both.
It could be both. I would say that we do not, but we are a very small faculty in English. So at least on the literature side, there are not that many of us who are teaching that number of courses. And I do think that in the composition program, there are quite a few people who do implement those choice options in a variety of ways.
Oh, and I'm sorry, perhaps I misunderstood the question. I thought I was referring to students working on that. Yeah, so this is not standard across our first year writing program. So there's other faculty who are, doing completely different formats and ways of grading. Although we certainly, as a first year writing community, talk a lot about different forms of grading, contract grading and ungrading and all of these things that are, considered kind of current best practices in the field.
Keely?
Hi, I'm also from Chestnut Hill College. In our writing program, we have experimented a lot with ungrading and contract grading, but it can be burdensome, especially for adjuncts who we almost solely rely on. And especially to get students to meet. I forget who it was to say, like, how do you get students to meet? Or how do you get students, for Peter, how do you get students to respond to emails? I think when they're getting emails about checking in my experience, they're really happy to respond to those because they feel seen and it's really important. But when you're saying, hey, we need to meet about what you turned in because we need to put a grade on it and talk about what what your goals were and how they line up with the rubric, etc. Like half the class is meeting with you. So it is time consuming. And the other thing is that, and actually I'm still using a version of it. And some adjuncts have started using versions of it also. We don't have any standardization. But another difficult thing really is the LMS. Like Canvas really confused things early on. I really was wishing for somebody who in data analysis or math at least to just come and look at my grade book and say, like, what is wrong here? Because there are no grades, and yet this student looks like he's failing, or this student looks like has an A and she hasn't even turned anything in. So getting used to all of that mess was actually quite time consuming. So the LMSs haven't sort of helped us at all when it comes to ungrading. Like we can say something's just complete or incomplete, so what I did start doing is I think what John's sort of indicating that, especially in college writing, putting a grade on something that's a higher stake grade, a higher stake assignment, and then doing a revise and resubmit. You're welcome to revise and resubmit this for a higher grade. And then lots of lower stake things that are just worth a couple points. Yeah. Because it was so confusing for a while.
Yeah,
Thank
those
you.
LMSs are really tough to work with when you want to break from any kind of traditional grading system. And our online learning service people are here, and they've tried to work with me before on how to work around that. It's a huge challenge.
Other questions or thoughts? I'm trying to jump from screen to screen to make sure I don't miss anybody. Adam.
Thanks, Margaret. Panelists, I appreciate what you've said here today. This is a fundamentally different way of being a faculty member than I was trained as a faculty member, and that might be familiar to many. And most of our institutions use a number of adjunct faculty members also who are teaching across institutions and have different demands on their time. I wonder if any of you have suggestions about ways in which our universities can help to support faculty in doing some of these things to improve the quality of learning.
Well, I mean, I'm sure Lisa can speak to, obviously the importance of centers for teaching and learning on campus. And, for our first year writing program, we have a teaching community that's, so I work with a lot of adjuncts because I coordinate the first year writing program, and so it's compensated. All their professional development time is compensated monetarily, not huge amounts, but more, just adding to what little they're getting. So I think those two things are important.
I think also to add just perhaps some in-services. This was part and parcel of my academic and clinical training, but just some training on emotional intelligence and conflict resolution, understanding some tactics that can help break down some of the barriers that can exist between professors, instructors, and students in a way that's sort of that's healthy and professional and respectable.
Lisa, anything you'd like to add?
No, I would just reiterate, I think Jen's wonderful point about when possible, trying to enable that time, particularly for part-time and contingent faculty, to engage with some of those really difficult and time-consuming changes.
Okay. I think we have time for one more question, and Ann Nielsen, I see your hand up.
Yes, I was just gonna, I wanted to mention on Jen's talk, and I do use Best by Date. I've done it recently, and I have found the quality of the work handed in is so much better, so much better. And I also wanted to compliment you, Jen, on the definition, on the milk carton definition. That is a fantastic way to get the point across of exactly what it is. So thank you.
Thank you, Ann. So we are nearing our ending time. I'd like to thank our panelists, Jen, Peter, and Lisa, for sharing their experiences, for getting us started on what I think was a good conversation. And that was our intent as we thought about ways to share the research identified in the survey, is how to engage faculty across our institutions in more productive conversations. And I think you've enabled us to do that. So my thanks to all of those who attended and contributed to the conversation in any way. Certainly by being here, you kept us going. And I'll turn things over to Martha.
Thanks, Margaret. And on behalf of the Association of Colleges of the Sisters of St. Joseph and the Chief Academic Officers, I want to thank you, as well as Peter, Jen, and Lisa for this leading today's conversation. Thank you too for the College of St. Rose for hosting this Zoom series. I hope you will join us for our last workshop in the series on April 18th. Our topic will be what's new and different for faculty post-pandemic. We're focusing on how are AI tools like ChatGPT altering teaching, learning, and research. So RSVP by emailing me to attend that workshop. I also want to let you know that the association will be hosting our national gathering on June 5th through the 7th at St. Joseph's University in New York. Participants can attend either in person or by Zoom, and registration is free for virtual participation. Find out more on our website, and after this workshop, I'll be sending information in an email about it. An evaluation will be sent also after this workshop, and I hope you'll be willing to provide your feedback on your experience today. Again, thank you for joining us and have a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.